I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. Local journalist and author Miranda Spivak has a new book coming out next week, Backyard Deals in Our Backyards: How Government Secrecy Harms Our Communities and the Local Heroes Fighting Back. The problem of government transparency is as old as government itself. Most famously, Justice Louis Brandeis is attributed this dictum: sunlight is said to be the best of disinfectants. Spivak argues that the problem has gotten worse under both Democratic and Republican leaders, and now the Trump administration, by firing federal workers, is further creating the conditions for even greater opacity in government. And not just in federal government. In Washington, D.C., the mayor and city council are considering rules to suspend some application of open meetings law, to be able to hold some meetings behind closed doors to better fend off attacks from the Trump administration and a Republican Congress. I talked with Miranda Spivak prior to the book's release and asked her where she stood on the issue and about her other case studies of local heroes fighting back against government secrecy. Stay with us.
I Hate Politics is brought to you by UMBC's Political Science Program, where you'll learn to shape public policy, impact communities, and function at the center of modern society. Learn more at shadygrove.umbc.edu.
I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we may hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society functioning, precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. Music for this episode comes from CatScan, an art pop rock band from Washington, D.C. Paul Chaperas on bass and vocals, Kevin Kingsley on guitars and saxophone, and Mason Shelby on synths and percussion. Their latest album, reflecting the time and this cultural moment, is called Everything is Normal. To feel better, go see them live. You can find out where they are playing on their Facebook and Instagram pages. If you have difficulty finding them, we share their events on I Hate Politics socials. Miranda Spivak, welcome to I Hate Politics.
Happy to be here.
Congratulations on your new book, Backroom Deals in Our Backyards: How Government Secrecy Harms Our Communities and the Local Heroes Fighting Back. Now, Justice Louis Brandeis, over a century ago, said that sunlight is said to be the best of disinfectants. 100 years later, you've written a book that continues the theme. Why do you think this is a persistent problem?
While elected officials talk a lot about transparency, mostly when it's convenient for them, the reality is that people in elected office are often really reluctant to have their discussions in public and to engage with the public in a really open way. Instead, they find, for a variety of reasons, that it's much easier to do their collegial work shrouded by secrecy. It's just easier. There's no objections out there. There are no angry constituents out there. Right now, if you look, for example, at the few Republicans who are having town halls, they are getting battered by angry constituents about what's going on in Washington, and a lot of them have just stopped having town halls. I think it's an example of how reluctant elected officials are to be transparent. I also think that routinely state and local governments, which is the primary focus of my book, are underfunded. And so a legislator in a tight economy, if he or she needs to choose between adding in more money for public records and making them more available, or it's a choice between funding schools, they're going to go for funding schools, or having a secret economic development deal that they subsidize somehow because they think it's going to bring more jobs. So there are, a lot of the reasons I would say are nefarious, but a lot of the reasons are sort of based on finances.
Maybe if you can explain the continuity and change over time that you see, where is this sort of, it got better, it got worse?
The real hero of open government and open records, at least in the 20th century, I would posit, is John Moss, congressman from California, who spent many, many years in the House of Representatives trying to get legislation through that Lyndon Johnson reluctantly finally signed in the mid-60s, and that was the Freedom of Information Act, which basically said that government should err on the side of transparency whenever possible and provide information. So legislatively, there has been progress, and as soon as the Freedom of Information Act was passed at the federal level, just about every state began to have their own open government laws, and not just records, but also open meetings. And so, at least on paper, I think we have made progress. And I think actually, despite my prior statements a few minutes ago saying, the politicians and people in the bureaucracies are very reluctant, there are people who do believe in open government, and they are in office and they are in government jobs. So I think as a concept, we have validated open government in the United States right now, as the Trump administration and the slash and burn expert Elon Musk go through and take down websites and fire, FOIA officers and subject matter experts, et cetera, all the people who have information and actually want to share information. We're heading for a real crisis on transparency at the federal level.
And has our governance gotten better as a consequence?
I think so. I mean, can I quantify that in a way that gives you data that shows a correlation? There are some studies that have shown that, in places where there's robust local news, which is one of the key elements, I think, to keeping government accountable, that there are correlations between that and better government, better deals for the public.
When I read your book, one of the things that I came away with is that governance is actually worse. After FOIA, after every state has passed FOIA equivalent law, our governance has not improved.
I just don't know if there's cause and effect, I guess is what I'm saying. I think there are a lot of reasons why government has not improved.
If you cannot identify cause and effect, then how do you expect politicians to take more steps toward open information if in fact it doesn't clearly improve governance?
I'm not sure that's how politicians think, frankly. They hear from angry constituents, as was the case in one of the accidental activists in the book, Richard Boltock, who after 10 years or so managed to talk the state of Maryland into improving a very dangerous intersection on River Road in Montgomery County. And only really after the publicity and the public pressure got so bad, and that was because of a horrible, horrible fatal accident at this intersection, then finally the state really stepped up.
He tried and tried and tried for 10 years. But it took a crash. Is the cause here open information or the actual tragedy? And that's what politicians respond to.
I'm not sure you can separate all of these things. I think that politicians listen they do listen to their constituents, especially when there is strength in numbers and a big public outcry, which there was in the case of this intersection, which Richard had fought for years.
Do you distinguish between the actual availability of data and the organizing that Richard Bolter encouraged?
I think that it's everything. I mean, I think what they did was, they learned how to use public records laws. They learned how to network with people. I cannot tell you how many people I talked to for this book, some of whom aren't actually in the book, but a lot of people use Facebook to organize and to find like-minded people or find people in other communities who are suffering from the same challenges that they are. So, they learn to network, they learn to organize, they learn to lobby. I mean, it's a whole combination of things that bring about change. It's not just getting the public records. In New York State, where there's a community in the book led by a guy named Michael Hickey, who discovered forever chemicals in his public water system, they didn't know anything about FOIL, which is the name of the New York Public Records Law, which I find very ironic because, of course, it's Freedom of Information Law, but the acronym is FOIL. And, of course, it's used by the government to FOIL requests all the time. But, they finally realized that they could get some information. They, meaning Richard, Michael and some of his colleagues, realized they could get some information from the state government. And when they did, and actually New York State did cough up some of the information, they came to realize that the state had known for a long time that the public water system in their community, Hoosick Falls, New York, was actually poisoned and hadn't done anything about it. So, that kind of discovery, if you can get it and then publicize it, that makes a big difference.
I think of your case studies as 5 Erin Brockovich stories. There's water quality, there is chemicals in firefighters' gear, there is toxic ash. Those types of pollution problems have existed for some time. But one of the most different case studies is this guy that you write about called Glenn Rodriguez, who is actually complaining about software. Pick up that story.
Well, Glenn Rodriguez is a very interesting case because his whole experience has to do with the use of proprietary software, which is now being widely used in the criminal justice system. And it's used to help judges and parole boards, et cetera, set bail, decide who can get out of prison, just for all kinds of things that data is now being fed into these systems, and then recommendations are being spit out. And they're not really being, the information is only as good as what's fed into the system. And, it's a whole AI kind of dilemma in many ways. But it's very, very common that the criminal justice system is using this kind of material. So Glenn Rodriguez was in prison in New York State for decades, and and he went in when he was a teenager, and he was an accessory to a murder, unfortunately. And so for the first several years, Glenn was not a model prisoner. He will tell you this. But at some point, he sort of turned a corner and he started studying, and he started doing a lot of things in prison that turned him into a very good prisoner. And for the last 10 years of his imprisonment, he had a perfect record, which, as he will tell you, and he told me, he said, that's very, very hard to accomplish in prison because there's just so many opportunities to get written up for minor infractions. And, you're sort of constantly on the defense, too, that your fellow prisoners are going to mess with you and you need to respond in some way. So he gets nominated for early release. And this is after 20-something years in prison. I mean, he had served a long time. And he gets nominated for early release 6 months earlier than he was supposed to get out. And he goes before the parole board, and they use a system called COMPAS, COMPAS, and it's an acronym for, a computerized system. And he gets turned down for early release, and it's just baffling. I mean, nobody had a record that was as clean as his. So the parole board didn't even know why they turned him down. They rely on these algorithms and these systems without really understanding how they come to their conclusions. And so Glenn went back to prison and he started to do something you're not supposed to do, which is he talked to fellow prisoners and found out what their compass score was. And some of them were very similar to his, even though he knew that these people had records that were way worse than his. And that it turned out that there was one question, Glenn figured this out after talking to like 100 fellow prisoners, that there was one question that had apparently tripped him up, which was that a counselor as well as the prisoner have to fill out the form that gets fed into the system. And this question had said, did this person have any kind of blemish on their record? And so his counselor filled it out to reflect his entire time in prison, which, yes, he did have blemishes on his record. But most of the other counselors had filled it out to go back 24 months. That's the guidance they had been given. So somehow his counselor didn't have that guidance or, ignored the guidance or whatever. And so there was no way Glenn could get out because this person had looked at his whole record. And his fellow prisoners who had records way worse than his, but had clean records for 24 months, everybody looked at this and they said, if this guy can't get out of prison early, nobody can. And so Glenn wanted to get what turned out to be a trade secret, which is a big problem, not just in the criminal justice system, but it's used all around the country. And he couldn't get, the company wouldn't give him the information about how they created this system and what information it used. But he sort of figured it out on his own where the problem was. Anyway, he goes back to the parole board 6 months later, so he served his full term, and he still had a bad compass score, but they let him out. It's just like, this is nuts.
In Glenn Rodriguez's case, suggests not purposeful evil, but rather bureaucratic mess, coordination problem, essentially. So in fact, you may argue that if there was a better software system, it would actually do its job better if it had specified in the system that it's 24 months. And it is a problem for sure, and it needs to be fixed, but I'd be hard-pressed to point to New York State for having screwed this up very purposefully. I mean, they did screw it up, so I'm not saying that, but was it purposefully?
Part of the issue in this case was nobody could really find out exactly how the system worked, the software system. And that's where, the company said, this is proprietary, we can't tell you. You have to look in this case about how this kind of crucial decision-making has been outsourced to a machine.
You don't think this happened before the software?
Oh, I think it may have, but I think there might have been a way to understand how the decisions were made because it wasn't somebody's proprietary software.
How would public records solve that coordination problem?
Well, I think that, first of all, how the system works, i.e. the software system, how is it making decisions? How is it weighing questions? Who's figuring out what the questions are? Was that some AI system or was that a human being in the parole board who said, here are the things we want answered and here's why? I mean, we don't know any of this. The parole board, I would say, bought the system, so why can't it be public? But that's one of the problems that happens.
The idea of backroom deals implies corruption. Explain where there is corruption in this case.
I think there's wrongdoing. Is wrongdoing a form of corruption? Is somebody being kept, when you're talking about corruption, I presume you're thinking about somebody getting paid off, maybe, or...
The implication of calling something backroom deals is that somebody got paid off.
I think it can be a variety of things.
Okay, what is the corruption here?
Well, to further talk about backroom deals, So all these agreements to allow data centers to be built, and Virginia is a big example of that right now. Those deals, those agreements are being made behind closed doors by local governments and state governments. So that's a backroom deal. Is somebody getting paid off? Not necessarily. Is somebody getting screwed? Probably the public, because they're going to end up paying for this one way or another without their permission.
The one thing that was surprising about your book was it did not include any real estate deals. The kind of data center deals that you're talking about, the big development projects that we associate with backroom deals, that's not a case study.
No, it's not. And the case studies I was looking for and that I think resonate with readers are issues that they will become involved with somehow, whether it's a school issue, whether it's the sewer issue in Alabama, whether it's their public drinking water. Now, the data center thing, which is huge in the Washington area right now, as I said, mostly in Northern Virginia, but Maryland is dealing with it too. There are a lot of backroom deals. When Amazon got its headquarters in Arlington, there were a lot of backroom deals, including, and that is mentioned in the book, including being given advance notice of public records requests so that the company could fight them.
I just saw this article and did an interview with the authors who argued that they looked at over 200 jurisdictions that wanted the Amazon headquarters, the second headquarters, HQ2 as it's known, in jurisdictions where the offer to Amazon was public, the public was most against them.
Mm-hmm.
Where they were private, they were most favorable. As a consequence, if you are a government trying to get Amazon to come to your jurisdiction, and we can talk about whether that's right or wrong, but if that is the goal, they find that keeping the offer private was a better way to deal with it.
Yeah, for sure. People can't gear up. They don't know what's going on.
On the other hand, they argue as well that when it's public, that then it actually becomes a race to the bottom because the other jurisdiction knows what you're doing.
And that's one of the arguments that companies will use about trade secrets, which is that, it's going to tip off their competitors.
Is there a balance?
I don't know how you balance it. I think it would be it would be a balance. I mean, obviously, you don't want to hurt private enterprise, which is a key element of our economy. But if you decide you want a government contract, I think you need to understand that there is going to be more transparency than if you're dealing private, business to business.
Washington, D.C. right now, the city council and the mayor are considering restricting open meetings law to allow them to better respond to the assault that they face, the attacks that they face from a Republican Congress and President Trump. How do you see it?
I should disclose that I am a board member of the DC Open Government Coalition, and the coalition is fighting that legislation. I am not directly involved in that fight, but I obviously agree with it. So the deal there is that the city government, the city council, the mayor, they already have the opportunity to go into private meetings under current law when, they deem it very, very important to do so. So what they're asking for right now, they actually already have the right to do that. They have to be open about the fact that they're doing it, and they have to have a good rationale for doing it. And it could well be that trying to combat this $1 billion cut that the Trump administration has inflicted on the city is a very important issue that they need to strategize about and figure out. Of course, they need help from Congress, too, which is the real issue. And the real issue here is an attack on home rule, which is a big problem. So, our position has been, and my personal position would be that They already have the right to do this. You don't have to put another layer of legislation on top of this, because the fear is that then it won't just be the mayor and the council, it'll be all kinds of agencies in the city government which don't have this emergency, who are going to try to do it too. And the proposed legislation would apply very broadly. So that's the problem.
Well, so are there conditions when secrecy is allowable? I understand national security is the standard here, but if you're looking at local and state government, which is your main, what are conditions when secrecy should be allowed in order for the government to function more efficiently? Or is that not a possibility in your point of view?
It is, and it's already written into every state's law, which is that there are conditions under which these bodies can meet in secret and have the right to. Real estate discussions are one of those. That's an exemption in practically every state. I think the point about this kind of stuff is that, for example, trade secrets, it's just abused. I mean, one of the examples I give in the book is that in West Virginia, when there was this water system that was the community was fighting about because there were pollution problems. The water system, when they gave up documents, they redacted the 800 number of the Public Utilities Commission and said it was a trade secret. That's where, I think you have to be very careful about tightening these laws, which is what they want to do in DC. DC already has the right to have these private meetings.
Clearly, elected representatives in the city have determined that the current law does not allow them to. So therefore, they are asking for this.
We think the current law does allow them to. So, I don't know how to solve that problem on this podcast.
We don't solve anything on podcasts, just to be clear. The question is really about where the line is to find that balance, because that seems to be the important point. That in some cases, yes, you will allow it. In some cases, you don't allow it. Who gets to decide how it's decided?
You should err on the side of transparency. So yes, there's a balance, but no, there isn't a balance in that sense. More like, yes, there's some exemptions to transparency, and here's what they are, and here's why we have them. And then you have to say, how is it being enforced? I mean, as I said, this trade secrets thing is widely abused around the country. It's very convenient. I mean, governments themselves have said they have trade secrets, and I'm like, what are you creating that has a trade secret?
So on the one hand, local and state governments have been remiss in sharing information, being transparent. On the other hand, local and state leaders seem to have long tenures, incumbency. Is there an argument here that their particular approach to public records and public information is validated, ratified by the people repeatedly via their incumbency?
God. I would say that incumbency is a great beneficiary of the lack of local news and local accountability groups. And so we don't get enough information that is already out there if we wanted to.
But incumbency was in place even when there was local news. 30, 40 years ago, when there was very active local news, incumbency was still in play.
Well, do we know what people vote on? I don't think they necessarily vote on transparency as transparency. I think they vote on, did this guy support, more money for my kid's school? Did they fix the road near where I live?
You have made a distinction in the book between local and state government on the one hand and federal government on the other. Do you see those two levels, the echelons, really different with respect to public information, a recognition of its use and utility? In some cases, for example, with the toxic ash case that you write about, they actually received help from the federal government.
The toxic ash thing has had to deal with a landfill filled with toxic ash from an out-of-state polluter, the Tennessee Valley Authority. And this is a small community in Alabama. Their problem, though, apart from the problem with the landfill, was a dysfunctional sewer system. And they did get, the federal government has stepped in through the Department of Agriculture to really is the key financer of this project. The problem there is that when the community members I write about wanted to get information about why certain decisions were being made about their community that they had not been given any input into, and they weren't sure were the right decisions about how the sewer system should function, they were stonewalled by the federal government, by the state government, and by the local water board. And actually had to go to court and got free legal help to go to court in D.C. and sue the Department of Agriculture to give out the information. And it took a couple of years. It was crazy. And that's so, the federal government on paper is generally better than state and local because the federal law says 20 days to respond to a records request. And, Maryland is 30 days, which is one of the worst in the country. And Alabama, I think, I'm paraphrasing now, but I think it's like in due time or something like, there was no deadline. In a lot of states, there's no deadline. Until now, when Trump is firing FOIA officers, as well as subject matter experts to whom the FOIA officers would go to get the information.
So you see a difference between Democrats and Republicans in this matter?
This Republican is particularly bad. I would say Democrats and Republicans have been equally, I wouldn't say indifferent to FOIA, but slow to fulfill. And I don't think party matters. And I don't know that party matters at the state level either on this because the governor of Alabama is a Republican, but the community leaders in the community I was writing about were all Democrats, and everybody was obstructing everybody.
You end the book with resources for activists. Mm-hmm. You want to speak to some key resources?
A group called the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press has very good open government guides, state by state, and they are a little technical, but there's a lot of good information in there that I think people who are civilians can glean information about how to go about doing this. Also, really building networks in your community, making sure you have strength in numbers, because that's what politicians listen to.
Are there any law resources that you recommend?
I would first go to your local bar association if you need legal help. And because lawyers are required by their bar licenses to do a certain amount of free legal work every year. And so you may be able to find somebody who can help you. That Reporters Committee list, by the way, which is compiled by lawyers in each state, the name of the lawyer is in there. So if for some reason you have sort of a First Amendment issue, which you might be able to talk to that person.
Miranda Spivak, thank you for taking the time to join us today. Congratulations on the book. It's called Backroom Deals in Our Backyards, How Government Secrecy Harms Our Communities and Local Heroes Fighting Back.
Thank you very much.
That's local journalist and author Miranda Spivak. Her new book, Backroom Deals in Our Backyards, How Government Secrecy Harms Our Communities and the Local Heroes Fighting Back, comes out next week. In a couple of weeks, we will have the other side of the story from my UMBC colleague, Eric Stoken, who is the lead author of a new article looking at how different jurisdictions opened or kept secret their offers for Amazon's second headquarters and what impact that had on public favorability. That's all for this episode of I Hate Politics, where we aim to stem the decline in local news by working with community voices. Don't forget to tune in to our Tuesday morning news analysis. I Hate Politics is produced by me, Sunil Dasgupta, with support from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I direct UMBC's political science program at the universities at Shady Grove in Montgomery County, where, among other things, we explore and learn about politics, government, and society close to home. Music for this episode comes from CatScan, an art pop rock band from Washington, D.C., Paul Chaperas on bass and vocals, Kevin Kingsley on guitars and saxophone, and Mason Shelby on synths and percussion. Their latest album reflecting the time and this cultural moment is called Everything is Normal. To feel better, go see them live. You can find out where they are playing on their Facebook and Instagram pages. If you have difficulty finding them, we share their events on I Hate Politics socials. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please email us at producer@ihppod.org. I hope you will subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home. See you next time.